In this episode, we're going to stay in the infrastructure mindset, but shift to a different kind of clue than name resolution, because not every useful insight comes from where a domain points. Domains also have a life history, and parts of that history can leave small breadcrumbs that help you understand who might be behind an asset, how it was set up, and how it fits into a broader cluster. WHOIS, WHOIS, is one of the traditional ways people think about registration information, but beginners often misunderstand it and either trust it too much or dismiss it completely. The truth is more practical. Registration data can be very useful when you treat it as evidence with limits and combine it with other signals like passive DNS and observed behavior. Leveraging registration breadcrumbs smartly means you know what kinds of details can matter, how to avoid common traps, and how to use those details to support or challenge hypotheses rather than to decorate a story. By the end, you should be able to think about registration context as one more disciplined lens for clustering and validation. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is understanding what WHOIS is in the first place, because the name makes it sound like a direct answer to who owns something, and that assumption leads beginners into trouble. WHOIS is a protocol and set of services used to provide registration-related information about internet resources, especially domain names. The idea historically was that you could look up who registered a domain, when it was created, when it expires, and what registrar managed it, along with contact details. In practice today, many registration details are obscured or generalized due to privacy services, policy changes, and legitimate safety concerns, which means you often will not get a clean name and address even when the domain is legitimate. That does not make WHOIS useless, but it means you must treat it as a partial, sometimes noisy view of registration history. Beginners sometimes view WHOIS as a truth oracle, but it is better to view it as one evidence stream among many. When you hold it in that role, it becomes a helpful breadcrumb trail rather than a misleading shortcut. Registration breadcrumbs are any details that hint at how a domain was acquired and managed, even if you cannot see a person's identity. Creation time and update time can be breadcrumbs, because they indicate when the asset came into existence and whether it has been modified. Registrar choice can be a breadcrumb, because certain operators may prefer specific registrars for convenience, payment options, or operational habits, although you must be careful not to turn that into a stereotype. Name server patterns can be breadcrumbs, because domains that share the same name servers or similar configuration patterns might be related, especially if the association is time-aligned and repeated. Even privacy services can sometimes act as breadcrumbs, not because privacy is suspicious, but because consistent reuse of the same protection pattern across a set of domains can contribute to a cluster hypothesis. The key is to treat each breadcrumb as a potential link, not as proof. Your job is to decide whether the breadcrumb is discriminating, meaning it helps distinguish between competing explanations. One of the most useful ways to leverage registration breadcrumbs is to support time alignment, which you have already seen is essential in infrastructure work. If you observe a domain in internal telemetry and you see that it was created very recently, that might support a hypothesis about a short-lived campaign asset, especially if other related domains share similar creation timing. If a domain is very old and has a long, stable history, that might support a benign explanation, although it does not prove benignity, because domains can be compromised or repurposed. Update timestamps can also matter because frequent updates might suggest active management, while a long period of inactivity might suggest abandonment or stability, depending on other context. Beginners sometimes treat creation date as a verdict, assuming new equals malicious or old equals safe, but those are shortcuts that can mislead. A disciplined approach uses timing as one clue that must be combined with behavior and other infrastructure evidence. When you interpret timing carefully, you can strengthen or weaken hypotheses without relying on stereotypes. Another smart use of registration data is in clustering, But clustering here requires extra caution because many registration attributes are shared across unrelated domains. For example, many legitimate domains use the same major registrars and the same default name server providers, so a shared registrar by itself is rarely discriminating. However, when you see multiple domains share an unusual combination of attributes, such as similar name server patterns plus similar creation timing plus resolution overlap, the cluster hypothesis becomes stronger. The point is that registration breadcrumbs are most useful when they converge with other evidence streams. Beginners sometimes build clusters based on a single registration attribute and then feel confident, but that is a recipe for false positives. A professional approach treats registration breadcrumbs as supporting evidence that can increase confidence when it aligns with stronger technical links. When it does not align, it can also be a reason to pause and reconsider whether a suspected cluster is actually two unrelated sets that merely share common internet plumbing. Name servers deserve special attention because they often sit at the boundary between registration and infrastructure, which can make them useful linking points. A domain's name servers can reflect a hosting decision, a managed service decision, or an operational pattern, and they can change over time. If you see a set of domains using the same name server pattern during the same relevant time window, that can be a meaningful association, especially if the pattern is not simply a default widely used service. At the same time, beginners need to remember that popular managed name services are extremely common. So many benign domains will share those name servers. The discriminating value comes from combination and context, not from the single fact of sharing. Name server relationships can be especially helpful when you are trying to decide whether a domain is part of a cluster that rotates endpoints, because name servers might remain stable even as resolution changes. This is another example of how breadcrumbs can provide durability when more visible infrastructure is volatile. A major beginner pitfall is treating redacted WHOIS details as suspicious because privacy has legitimate reasons and is widely used by normal organizations and individuals. If you assume privacy equals maliciousness, you will bias your analysis and your triage decisions in a way that produces noise. The more disciplined view is that privacy reduces the value of identity fields, but it does not eliminate the value of other breadcrumbs like timing, registrar, name server patterns, and consistency across a suspected cluster. Privacy can also be a useful node in your confidence calibration because it limits what you can verify, but it is not evidence of intent. When you communicate your findings, you want to avoid implying that privacy itself is a red flag. Instead, you can say that registration identity could not be independently verified from available registration records, which is a neutral statement about evidence limits. This careful language protects you from bias and keeps your output professional. Another pitfall is taking self-reported registration fields at face value, because registration data can be intentionally falsified by malicious operators and can also contain mistakes by legitimate registrants. This is why identity details, when present, must be treated as claims rather than as confirmed facts. A disciplined analyst looks for consistency rather than for literal names, such as whether multiple domains share the same claimed organization, the same contact pattern, or the same formatting. Even then, you must be careful, because a shared fake identity can be copied across domains easily. This is where combining registration breadcrumbs with technical evidence becomes essential. If an identity claim aligns with technical clustering and observed behavior, it may increase confidence. If it does not, it might be irrelevant or misleading. Beginners often want a simple answer to who did it, but registration identity is rarely strong enough to provide that by itself. The smart use is to treat it as one part of a broader evidence picture. Registration breadcrumbs also help in validation, especially when you are trying to decide whether a pivot is worth following. If you discover a domain and find that its creation timing, name server configuration, and update behavior closely match a known cluster pattern you have seen in your own work, that increases the chance that further pivoting will produce value. If the breadcrumbs look completely unrelated, you might still pivot, but you might do so with lower expectations and tighter stopping points. In this sense, registration information can act as a triage enhancer, helping you decide where to invest attention. It can also act as a reality check on assumptions. For example, if you believe two domains were related based on superficial similarities, but their registration histories are completely different in timing and management patterns that might weaken the relationship and encourage you to look for stronger links before merging them. This is how breadcrumbs support disciplined skepticism without turning into cynicism. Another smart way to leverage registration context is in storytelling and communication, because stakeholders often understand time and ownership concepts more easily than deep technical infrastructure. Explaining that a cluster of domains was registered within a tight window and managed in a similar way can provide intuitive support for why you believe the domains may be related, especially when you also anchor the story in observed behavior. This can help your synthesis feel coherent without relying on jargon. At the same time, you must be careful not to oversell registration breadcrumbs as proof, because that can mislead decision makers. The professional move is to explain what the breadcrumbs suggest, what limitations exist, and how they align with stronger evidence like internal telemetry and resolution history. When you communicate this way, you give the audience a reason to trust your reasoning while still understanding the uncertainty. That balance is what makes your intelligence usable. To close, the core idea is that WHOIS and registration breadcrumbs can add valuable historical and operational context to domain analysis, but only when you treat them as evidence with limits and use them in combination with other signals. Registration timing can support time alignment, name server patterns can support clustering, and consistent management behaviors can strengthen hypotheses when they converge with technical links like passive DNS. At the same time, privacy, redaction, and falsified fields mean you should be cautious about identity conclusions and avoid bias-driven assumptions. Smart use means asking whether a breadcrumb is discriminating, whether it is time-aligned, and whether it is independent support rather than decorative detail. When you use registration context this way, it becomes a steady complement to infrastructure pivoting rather than a misleading shortcut. Next, we'll build directly on this by exploring how to cluster weak signals into compelling hypotheses, because once you have multiple small clues from different sources, you need a disciplined way to combine them without overstating what they mean.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.